The fate of the Pacific theater of war had nearly been sealed in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. US forces had done the impossible. They had taken down over 600 Japanese warplanes, leaving Japan's carrier forces crippled. Only about 100 aircraft remained to be split among the Japanese aircraft carriers that were still afloat. Yet, the empire wasn't defeated. Japan still commanded some of the most powerful battleships in the world, and they were gearing up for a desperate move to prevent America from seizing the Philippines. For Japan, losing this territory was synonymous with losing the war, an inconceivable prospect. On October 25, 1944, Japan's southern force, anchored by the veteran battleships Yamashiro and Fusō, charged into the Surigao Strait as a component of the Sho-Go defense strategy. However, they unwittingly sailed straight into an ambush orchestrated by the US 7th Fleet. The Japanese found themselves ensnared in the perilous and constricted waters, confronting 6 aging US battleships. Many of these ships had been resurrected after being sunk in Japan's assault on Pearl Harbor, and they were now primed for revenge. With neither fleet benefiting from carrier support, sailors on both sides braced for the impending collision. History was on the cusp of recording the last battleship versus battleship engagement, and it could seal the fate of the war. By 1944, the Pacific theater of World War II had devolved into a harrowing, protracted conflict of devastating scope, and the events set in motion could not be undone. The Allies had successfully waged relentless campaigns, uprooting the Japanese from many strategic islands and leaving others isolated and vulnerable. As the conflict entered its second year, the Allies emerged more fierce and defiant after having fought in the Solomon Islands, Wake Island, and the Mariana Islands, the last of which had been recently seized by the Allies, giving them a pivotal staging point. The capture of the Marianas afforded the Americans a crucial position. They could launch their groundbreaking new B-29 Superfortress bombers to strike at Japan's heart. But the Japanese were far from defeated. In a desperate retaliation, they unleashed their might in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Air raid sirens wailed and the skies were set ablaze with combat. But when the smoke cleared, the US Navy emerged triumphant, decimating the Japanese air power, sinking their carriers, and dealing a crippling blow to their morale. The US had shot down over 600 Japanese warplanes, leaving the Imperial Japanese Navy's remaining carriers practically useless as they were left with no planes to carry and no pilots to fight. Yet, even in the face of such losses, the Japanese had fortified the Philippines with considerable land-based air forces that still posed a grave danger to Allied forces in the region and worried high-ranking commanders like Admiral Chester Nimitz. Strategists gathered, debating their next move. Admiral Ernest J. King and Nimitz stood on one side, pushing for a blockade of the Philippines and an invasion of Formosa. On the other, General Douglas MacArthur had made a heartfelt promise to the Filipino people in 1942, and he pushed passionately for a return to the Philippines. Formosa, now Taiwan, while important, presented its own set of challenges. With the Australian army spread thin and resources stretched, an invasion there seemed nearly impossible without reinforcements from Europe, which were bound by the ongoing war with Germany. As tensions rose amid the Allied commanders, a historic meeting took place. MacArthur, Nimitz and President Roosevelt convened, debating fiercely for hours about the best course of action, but the impasse would continue. Weeks turned into months, and as the debate raged on, Nimitz finally, begrudgingly, conceded to MacArthur's vision. The verdict was clear: US servicemen would liberate the Philippines, and MacArthur would keep his promise. With the stage set, Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid's 7th Fleet prepared for an amphibious assault on Leyte, the heart of the central Philippines. The Pacific showdown was about to begin. Just as the American plan started to unfold, the chaotic nature of war began to wreak havoc on their battle strategy. The US 7th Fleet, one of these most powerful forces in the Pacific, and composed of a union of US Navy and Royal Australian Navy ships, had been tasked with spearheading the invasion. But even before the naval showdown in Leyte Gulf ignited, HMAS Australia and USS Honolulu, critical fleet components, were seriously damaged by Japanese aerial attacks while screening the amphibious landings that preceded the battle at sea. Forced to retreat, the two ships began the dangerous 11,700-mile journey to the safety of Manus Island, leaving a weakened 7th Fleet that would now have to find a way to turn the odds in their favor for what was sure to be a devastating battle ahead. The other force in the invasion scheme was the US 3rd Fleet, led by Admiral William F. Halsey Jr. His pride and joy, Task Force 38, stood as the vanguard, prepared to shield and bolster the invasion forces. However, behind the fearsome assembly, a hidden issue threatened to risk the mission. No single admiral would oversee the entire operation. This disjointed command structure, paired with communication breakdowns, brewed a tempest that threatened to unleash disaster upon the American forces. Ironically, the Japanese echoed this same vulnerability with their three-pronged fleet. The Japanese strategists knew they were at a disadvantage with a diminished carrier force. Still, they calculated several ways to claim victory. Japanese commanders were confident they knew what the American game plan was. Combined Fleet Chief Soemu Toyoda meticulously drafted 4 victory plans. Despite the dwindling fuel reserves, these ambitious strategies demanded Japan commit almost all its remaining forces. On October 12, 1944, Halsey made his move, launching devastating raids against Formosa and the Ryukyu Islands. The idea was to neutralize the threat of Japanese air interference in the Leyte operations. As the skies rained fire and metal, the Japanese activated Sho-Go 2, unleashing a torrent of aerial fury upon the 3rd Fleet. But in this frenetic dance of carriers versus land-based aircraft, the Japanese were shattered, losing a staggering 600 aircraft. With the Americans advancing upon the Philippines, the Japanese seamlessly transitioned to their primary strategy. Sho-Go 1. At the heart of this strategy was a deadly deception. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's ships, the Northern Force, would draw away the American defense. Though armed with carriers, these were merely decoys, deprived of significant air support. Meanwhile, 2 other potent forces would converge on Leyte, seeking to exploit any chinks in the American armor. The battle ahead meant everything for the Japanese Navy. As Admiral Soemu Toyoda somberly declared, quote, "Should we lose in the Philippines operations, even though the fleet should be left, the shipping lane to the south would be completely cut off, so that the fleet, if it should come back to Japanese waters, could not obtain its fuel supply. If it should remain in southern waters, it could not receive supplies of ammunition and arms. There would be no sense in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of the Philippines." The fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to be defined. As the forces gathered for the battles ahead, poor planning plagued the US even before the action began. The 3rd Fleet was by far the most powerful assembly the Navy had at its disposal. Still, when the order to move out reached 3rd Fleet Commander Halsey, he had already sent 2 carrier groups to resupply at Ulithi. He immediately called back one of the carrier groups while the other sailed on to the fleet's base. The unfortunate decision meant that the most capable American carrier group would not play an essential role in the battle ahead, and the 3rd Fleet would only have 60% of its air strength for most of the engagement. Vice Admiral Takehiro Onishi initiated the attack by leading 3 consecutive waves of aircraft from his 1st Air Fleet stationed in Luzon. These carriers were simultaneously conducting airstrikes on airfields in Luzon to prevent Japanese land-based air assaults on the Allied ships in Leyte Gulf. Onishi's attack waves, each comprising approximately 50 to 60 aircraft, were integral to this coordinated effort. Many Japanese planes involved in the attack faced interception, were shot down or forced to retreat thanks to the Hellcats under Sherman's Combat Air Patrol. In a remarkable instance, Commander David McCampbell single-handedly downed a record 9 aircraft. When he ran out of fuel after the brutal dogfights, he managed to return and perform an urgent landing on USS Langley because the Essex's deck was too busy to accommodate him. Despite the lethality and efficiency with which Allied pilots took care of the Japanese attackers, one bomber managed to slip through the defenses and at 9:38 a.m. hit the light carrier USS Princeton with a 551-pound armor-piercing bomb. The flight deck was moving 10 fighters that had just landed from a previous mission. The hangar deck was fully loaded with fueled Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers ready for another sortie. A torpedo bomber exploded as the bomb pierced through the flight deck, triggering 5 other aircraft to ignite in a devastating chain reaction that tore through the hangar deck. The explosion hit the part of the ship where most of the torpedoes were kept, along with some unsecured bombs. This resulted in a massive explosion, igniting a severe fire in Princeton's hangar. Her emergency sprinkler system malfunctioned. The fire spread swiftly, triggering further explosions. As the flames intensified aboard the carrier, the light cruiser Birmingham hastened to Princeton's aid, initiating urgent rescue and firefighting efforts. Although the fire was eventually subdued, at 3:23 p.m., a colossal explosion erupted from the carrier's aft bomb storage. This caused further casualties on Princeton, but more devastatingly, the blast impacted Birmingham, claiming 233 lives and injuring 426 of those who were trying to assist. Such was the extent of the damage to Birmingham that she had to withdraw. Another light cruiser and 2 destroyers also suffered damage. Despite tireless efforts, Princeton was beyond salvation. After evacuating the remaining crew, she was scuttled by the light cruiser Reno at 5:50 p.m. 17 Grumman F-6 F Hellcat fighters and 12 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers sank with the Princeton. In retaliation, US warplanes from the Intrepid and Cabot, part of Bogan's group, struck around 10:30 a.m., landing hits on battleships Nagato, Yamato and Musashi. They also inflicted severe damage on the heavy cruiser Miyoko, forcing it to retreat. A subsequent attack wave, including VB-15 Helldivers and VF-15 Hellcats from the Essex, dealt another 10 blows to Musashi. As she retreated, listing to port, a third wave from the Enterprise and Franklin came with 8 torpedoes and 11 bombs. After enduring at least 17 bomb strikes and 19 torpedo hits, Musashi capsized and sank around 7:35 p.m. A staggering 259 sorties targeted the center force that day. Yet this was insufficient to neutralize the menace from Kurita. The most substantial assault during the Sibuyan Sea encounter was aimed at the battleship Musashi, which was sunk, and the cruiser Miyoko, severely damaged by an aerial torpedo. However, every other vessel in Kurita's fleet remained combat-ready and advanced. It wasn't until the next day that the far less capable force of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and 400 aircraft engaged in the Battle off Samar. Kurita then redirected his fleet out of the aircraft's range, bypassing the ailing Musashi during their retreat. Halsey presumed this withdrawal indicated his threat was momentarily neutralized, yet Kurita lingered until 5:15 p.m. before rerouting towards the San Bernardino Strait. Regrettably, due to Admiral Halsey's decision and ambiguous communication, Kurita navigated through the San Bernardino Strait undetected during the night. This allowed him to make an unforeseen and dramatic entrance off Samar's coast the next morning, posing a direct threat to the Leyte landings. The unfolding chaos stemmed from a grave communication blunder. On the 24th of October, Admiral Halsey's US Third Fleet encountered significant challenges after detecting the Japanese southern and center forces. Before engaging these forces, Halsey drafted a defense strategy for the San Bernardino Strait with Task Force 34. This force was to comprise 4 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. However, a telegraphic message dispatched at 3:12 p.m., which detailed this strategy, was vaguely phrased, causing grave misconceptions among the other US forces. Both Admirals Nimitz and Kincaid deduced from this message that TF-34 had already been established and was actively safeguarding the strait. Halsey's efforts to rectify the misunderstanding at 5:10 p.m. via voice radio fell on deaf ears, as the 7th Fleet couldn't intercept the message due to distance constraints. Complicating matters, that same evening, Halsey was duped by a Japanese diversion tactic. Assured that the northern force posed the primary threat, he rerouted most of his fleet northward, mistakenly convinced that the center force had been neutralized earlier. Given the previous miscommunication, Kincaid and Nimitz operated under the false impression that TF-34 remained at the San Bernardino Strait, while in reality, it was advancing north with Halsey. Even when confronted with warnings from reconnaissance and fellow officers, Halsey pursued the northern route, lured by the Japanese ruse. This left the San Bernardino Strait entirely unprotected on the night of the 24th of October. The only barrier standing between Kurita's formidable Japanese center force and the American landing craft was Kincaid's ill-equipped escort carrier group. Without the support of battleships or larger ships, this posed a monumental risk to the Leyte landings. Halsey's communication lapses and susceptibility to Japanese subterfuge would inflict dire repercussions on the US forces in that area. As Halsey's small force was left to defend the American landing by itself, Admiral Oldendorf was deployed to defend the Surigao Strait, receiving fire support from 6 groups of outdated battleships: Mississippi, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Tennessee, West Virginia, and California. Additionally, Oldendorf had at his command 28 destroyers, 8 cruisers, and a significant fleet of PT boats. Although Oldendorf's force was superior, it wasn't overwhelming. 5 of the 6 battleships had either been sunk or severely damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor and were subsequently repaired. Tennessee, California, and West Virginia had been entirely rebuilt. Admiral Oldendorf strategically positioned his battleships throughout the strait exits, with cruisers and destroyers at crucial flanks to counter any Japanese torpedo advances. Meanwhile, the PT boats were tasked with radar surveillance of the Japanese forces. On the other side, Nishimura's southern force comprised battleships Yamashiro and Fusō, heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers: Shigure, Michishio, Asagumo, and Yamagumo. They surged through the southern entrance of the Surigao Strait, aiming for Leyte Gulf's northern entrance to reinforce Kurita's firepower against the American landing. Around 10 p.m. on October 24th, American PT boats detected the Japanese squadron. Despite their preparations for an attack, Nishimura pressed on, confident they could bypass the PT boats and their torpedoes. Initially, they succeeded. For over 3 hours, the torpedo boats relentlessly attacked the Japanese fleet, firing dozens of torpedoes, yet failing to land a single hit. However, Nishimura's strategy soon unraveled when American destroyers, followed closely by the battleships, obstructed the Japanese fleet's path. Nishimura found himself ensnared in a deadly trap. By 3 a.m. on October 25th, US destroyers mounted their assault from both sides. Nishimura's ships, particularly his battleships, took the brunt of the attack. Yamashiro sustained damage but continued to steam on, while Fusō, struck by USS Melvin's torpedo, broke in 2 and sank. 2 of Nishimura's destroyers were sunk and another was hit and forced to retreat, only to sink later. Utilizing their advanced radar, the US fleet, including the 6 battleships, pursued the Japanese survivors. Notably, West Virginia's radar detected Nishimura's ships from an extraordinary distance of 42,000 yards. The American battleships unleashed a barrage that the Japanese could neither match nor adequately respond to, thanks to the superior American radar fire control. Mississippi later made history by firing the last ever salvo from a battleship in naval warfare. Amid the turmoil, Japanese ships desperately returned fire, but most met a dire fate, including Yamashiro, which sank with Nishimura aboard. Of the entire fleet, only Mogami and Shigure managed a retreat. The Japanese rear, commanded by Vice Admiral Shima, faced navigational issues due to inadequate radar and tidal misjudgments. In the confusion, American PT-137 torpedoed the light cruiser Abukuma. Upon discovering the remnants of Nishimura's fleet, Shima, misreading the situation, ordered a retreat. This retreat was not without its mishaps, as his flagship Nachi collided with Mogami, leading to the latter's demise. In this historic last battleship clash, Japanese forces were efficiently neutralized. Only Shigure survived, only to be sunk by the American submarine Blackfin in January 1945. Perhaps emblematic of their desperation and the overall strategic situation, the day following the battle at Surigao Strait saw the Japanese forces launch their first ever kamikaze attack, hitting the US escort carrier Santee and claiming 16 lives. Halsey had left San Bernardino Strait unguarded, mistakenly leading 7th Fleet's officers to believe Halsey's battleships were defending the strait. This miscalculation enabled Kurita's center force, which still boasted 4 battleships, multiple cruisers, and destroyers, to emerge unchallenged and steam southward along the coast of the island of Samar. Standing between them and their goal were just the 7th Fleet's modest escort carriers, defended by lightly armed destroyers and destroyer escorts. Upon discovering Kurita's force, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague launched his carrier's planes and cleverly took cover in a rain squall. As the Japanese fleet approached, thinking they faced Halsey's powerful 3rd Fleet, a scene of fierce combat unfolded. USS Johnston heroically charged into the Japanese force, landing a blow on the heavy cruiser Kumano. Inspired by Johnston's audacity, Sprague ordered destroyers Hole and Heermann and the destroyer escort Samuel B to join the fray. Even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, these ships valiantly faced the imposing Japanese force in a gamble to disrupt Japanese operations enough to give US forces an advantage. As these ships moved closer to the enemy formations, Lieutenant C. Dr. Copeland of Samuel B. Roberts informed his crew over a loudspeaker that they were entering, quote, a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected. As the Japanese continued their advance, both Hole and Roberts suffered multiple hits and sank swiftly. The Johnston, having fired all its torpedoes, persisted with its 5-inch guns until eventually succumbing to a group of Japanese destroyers. While the carriers of Taffy 3 faced the onslaught of Japanese artillery and retaliated, Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague commanded an all-out aerial offensive utilizing every available aircraft. These determined aerial counterstrikes confounded the Japanese, even though the US relied on older, less effective planes. Gambier Bay, drawing significant attention, fell to the overwhelming power of the Yamato. The staunch American resistance baffled Admiral Kurita, making him suspect he was contending with a substantial portion of the Third Fleet. Kurita retreated, believing a more formidable US fleet was positioned north. Thus, he missed a prime chance to disrupt the US landings at Leyte. This decision stemmed from misinformation, inadequate reconnaissance, and the impressive resilience of the Seventh Fleet. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Northern Force, primarily comprising 4 aircraft carriers. Among these was the Zuikaku, the last of the carriers that had taken part in the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. This fleet also featured 2 older battleships, the Hyuga and Ise, retrofitted for aircraft use. However, they lacked aircraft during this battle due to losses from the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Additionally, the force was bolstered by 3 light cruisers and 9 destroyers. With only 108 aircraft, Ozawa's fleet acted as a decoy, aiming to divert the American fleet away from the Leyte landing zones. On the 24th of October, the Americans only detected Ozawa's force late in the afternoon. The force led by Admiral Halsey, which was moving northwards, vastly outmatched Ozawa's decoy. It consisted of 5 large fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, 6 modern battleships, 8 cruisers and 41 destroyers, carrying between 600 and 1,000 aircraft. Earlier that day, Halsey had detached TF-34 under Vice Admiral Lee, which centered around the Third Fleet's 6 battleships. Halsey's initial strategy involved Mitcher's aircraft launching strikes, followed by Lee's battleships. At daybreak, Ozawa sent the bulk of his remaining aircraft against the Third Fleet. Japan's shortage of aircraft and skilled pilots meant the seasoned Americans had little trouble neutralizing the Japanese squadrons. American combat air patrols intercepted most of them, allowing no damage. The few Japanese aircraft that survived retreated to bases in Luzon. Simultaneously, Admiral Mitcher, in control of TF-38, ordered the American carrier groups to dispatch their first wave of 180 aircraft, even before locating the Northern Force. When they finally made contact at 7:10 a.m., the aircraft were combat-ready. The US assault commenced at 8 a.m., obliterating Ozawa's 30-plane combat air patrol. Throughout the day, TF-38 conducted relentless airstrikes on the Northern Force, sinking the Zuikaku, Chitose, Zuiho, and destroyer Akizuki. Both the light carrier Chiyoda and cruiser Tama sustained heavy damage, forcing Ozawa to shift his command to the light cruiser Oyodo. By 8 a.m. on the 25th of October, distress signals from the 7th Fleet, locked in combat with Japan's southern force near Samar, began reaching Admiral Halsey. A dire message from Kincaid stressed their perilous situation and pleaded for both air support and fast battleships. Another message emphasized the 7th Fleet's dwindling ammunition supplies, making Halsey's hesitancy to send aid even more contentious. From Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz, assessing the scenario, relayed a coded message to Halsey. A decoding error added the phrase, "The world wonders," which Halsey mistakenly took as a reprimand from Nimitz, causing him considerable distress. At last, by 11:15 a.m., Halsey ordered Task Force 34 to proceed south to Samar. But their belated movement meant they too late to support to the beleaguered 7th Fleet or intercept Kurita's departing force. Ultimately, Halsey couldn't rectify his oversight or adequately address the 7th Fleet's desperate pleas. However, due to Kinkaid's forces' valiant efforts and strategic leadership, the outmatched and outgunned 7th Fleet was able to live to fight another day. The battle off Cape Engano concluded around 11:10 p.m. when the American submarine Jalao torpedoed and sank Ozawa's light cruiser Tama. The broader battle for Leyte Gulf wrapped up following a few final air raids on the withdrawing Japanese units on the 26th of October. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was a turning point in the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy suffered devastating losses from which it would never recover, including the sinking of its aircraft carriers and battleships. This severely curtailed their ability to project power and meaningfully challenge the US Pacific Fleet thereafter. After the naval clashes, American forces were one step closer to reclaiming the Philippines, ending Japan's empire in the Pacific, and paving a path toward the end of the war.